think we're.
Hello. How are you doing, Brian?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, not bad. Nice to have you on board again. Thank you for everyone that's tuned in so far. Well, we have got a very special video for you guys. Something that is not on the market, something that's not on YouTube. I don't think there's any active military discussions out there that talk about the Chinese military. There's a lot of YouTubers which are based on having a military channel, but they're very pro-Western. For example, Brian, I've seen a couple of channels. They still believe that Russia is losing, and they've got
Yeah.
millions of subscribers. And I don't think there's any channels out there which actually talk about all of the latest advances on the Chinese military. I have seen a couple of kind of AI related, maybe a couple of Chinese people have raised it, but it's AI. It's not a real voice; it's AI voice, and also it's probably coming out of a Chinese website. So you got to kind of take those things with a grain of salt. I think it could be propaganda. You never know. But we've done our own research, and we've decided to kind of discuss it amongst ourselves. Looking at Western sources, Eastern sources, and try and discuss the Chinese military advances, the latest hardware, the latest units. Is the US worried about them? Are they going to be a game changer? Will they make a difference in a war in the Taiwanese Strait, if there is a war in the Taiwanese Strait? So it's going to be a really good show today. I'm quite excited. And so without further ado, Brian, let's start. And first of all, I'm just going to present some slides. I wonder if you can.
What about the screen? So you have like the live stream starting soon.
Oh yeah, I'm going to
Image
get rid of that. Yeah.
takes a
Um,
while to get used to doing these live streams because you got to kind of
yeah.
be the guy behind the scenes and also presenting at the same time. It's not as easy as it looks. Some people make it look real easy.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to figure out how to upload um, kind of a JPEG file. It asked me for a number of options: slides, extra camera, video file, but it doesn't tell me how to upload a JPEG. Um,
Maybe it's easier if you have two screens. Are you able to share one of your screens or not
yeah.
really?
Oh, yeah, I can share it.
Maybe while you're doing that, maybe we can talk about why we want to talk about this topic in the first place. Why are we interested in talking about Chinese military capabilities? And I think most people will realize the obvious answer is Taiwan. You see all of this tension building up over Taiwan. The United States playing this double game where it has for many years recognized the one China policy and does not recognize Taiwan's independence, and yet at the same time, covertly, it is supporting and encouraging what is essentially separatism. And there is a military conflict that could potentially break out over Taiwan, because if Taiwan does try to go all in on separatism, the rest of China is going to stop it, and that will require military force. And I think China would prefer not to do that, but the US, as we can see, they're very intent on creating crises around the world. We've seen them, what they've done in Ukraine versus Russia, and they're trying to do a very similar process to China through Taiwan. And it's much worse regarding Taiwan because Taiwan is actually part of China.
Exactly. So I was wondering if the viewers can see this image that we've got on the screen. So the first image we have, this is the H-20 stealth bomber, which the Chinese is probably gonna release sometime next year, and it's been under 20 years of development. And it's very similar to the United States B-21 bomber. And obviously, I got to stress that all of these stuff that we're discussing, we don't know for sure because a lot of it is shrouded in secrecy. We are only going by what's out there on the internet. We are doing our own investigations. So you got to take what we're saying with a grain of salt. Nothing's confirmed. This is all our opinions. So what do you think, Brian? Do you think this would be a game changer? I mean, for me, the way I see it, China's nuclear capability. A couple of years ago, it was only they could only launch nuclear missiles from land and from their nuclear submarines. They've not really had a way to deploy nuclear missiles through bombers. I mean, this is a triad which the United States had for years now. It's called the triad, I believe, nuclear triad. So what that means, you are able to deliver nuclear missiles by land, by sea, by nuclear, and by air as well. And this would be a complete game changer. Because this would mean places like Guam, Hawaii, even all the way up to Australia would be in serious danger if this comes on board over the next year or so. What do you think, Brian? Do you think this will make a major difference?
If they are indeed going to use it to deliver nuclear weapons, I think that it will definitely enhance the sense of deterrence that China's nuclear arsenal would have. So, okay, they have very capable missiles. I mean, they have some of the best missiles in the world, and that's even Western analysts admitting that they have submarines capable of doing this. It's very hard to find submarines, especially if there's many of them. It's very hard to find them before they would launch missiles. They could launch those missiles quite close to their intended target. And then if you have an aircraft capable of delivering nuclear weapons, then that enhances the deterrence. And this is something that you hope you never have to use, but it's a capability that you would want to develop. Now, the United States has used its stealth fighters and bombers in conflicts in the past, but I don't think that this would be something that would be overly useful for China. Because again, they have, let's say there is a armed conflict over Taiwan, because China is not interested in fighting wars far from Chinese territory. All of their military capabilities are, again, admittedly, even Western analysts admit this, even though Western propagandists claim that China is building a military power to take over the world, they admit when they're actually doing real analysis that this is defensive in nature and that everything is concentrated on Chinese territory. So a conflict over Taiwan hitting military targets on the island or around it, they can easily do this with their missiles. It would be much easier to do it that way than to use, say, a small handful of these stealth bombers, because say they release this next year, it's going to be a small number. There's a long process of getting these ready to actually use operationally. I know that the Western media makes it seem like you can just get a new weapon and start using it right away, like in an episode of G.I. Joe, because this is how they're portraying the whole situation in Ukraine. But it actually takes years. You were saying how many years they were developing this. It'll take years more once they unveil it to get it operational and to work out all of the problems that it might have. Even the United States has issues when they release new weapons. F-35, F-22, these are just some of the more recent examples.
Sure. It definitely sounds like a really good deterrent, and especially if ever a war on Taiwan ever takes place, it's a really good deterrent for other Western countries joining into the war. And I'm talking about countries like UK, parts of Europe, because if China has this capability, they would literally think twice before joining in, because otherwise China would have the capability to go into UK's airspace and start dropping bombs, so it gives another headache to the Western countries before they kind of declare war over the Taiwan Strait. But I want to ask you, Brian, I have seen some articles where this technology has come from, and there's a lot of articles pointing to the fact that there was a stealth bomber which was brought down in Yugoslavia during the NATO bombing, and they're saying that the Chinese got hold of that bomber, and this is one of the reasons why the Chinese embassy got bombed, because they thought that this bomber was kept inside the Chinese embassy at the time, and this is the reason why the Chinese embassy got bombed in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, I would say. What do you think about that? Do you think there's any truth in that?
I don't know. That stories like that are very hard to decipher. I mean, I think China would have been interested. That was the F-117 stealth fighter. So it's a smaller version of the B-2 bomber that, the flying wing version. So this was the smaller one. And I think the Russians would have been very interested in getting their hands on that, and China. But I don't know what the process would have been for that to happen. So yeah, that's all speculation. I'm really not sure, but I think at this point, I think every developed every nation with a very well developed military industrial complex understands the concepts of stealth. They have their own radar systems, they have their own ability to develop materials and strategies to evade them, and so I think at this point, I don't know how much that F-117, if either side got, Russia or China got their hands on it, how much that would have contributed to the design now. It's hard to tell.
Sure, because that wreckage has still not been found. So somebody somewhere has got it. But most of the stealth is depending on the stealth coating. So, if they can, it's not just the shape, it's also the stealth coating, how they kind of, I'm pretty sure that any country that would pick that up would kind of reverse engineer it and try and find out ways they can to see how they can avoid radar. So this brings me up to the next question, the next unit. And I'm just going to share my screen again. So the next unit in discussion is this. This is the Chinese radar, and apparently it can detect stealth aircrafts as well. And I just wanted to kind of, and this is just, obviously this has not been tested. I just want to kind of confirming with everyone, this has not been tested. And but the Chinese have said that they have managed to build this radar. And I'd ask you this, Brian, if a country can build stealth aircraft, surely they can find a way to discover their aircraft, because they can do their own testing, right? And also, should the US be worried regarding this radar? Do you think you can find out B-21 bombers or even F-35s?
Yeah, because if you think about it, how was the F-117 shot down over Yugoslavia? It was because the Soviet era air defense systems, even back then, could detect it. It's just a much smaller blip on the screen, but they were flying the same route every single night around the same time. And so when they saw this little tiny signature that they might have otherwise ignored, they were able to take it out. Now you have to think between the hardware and the software, certainly they have developed a way to find, identify, and down these aircraft. And you would notice, say, the conflict in Syria, for example, I'm not really sure exactly what warplanes Israel is using to carry out their strikes on Syrian targets. They have F-35s, if I'm not mistaken, and they are still conducting standoff attacks because they don't want to get too close to Soviet-era air defense systems and the modern air defense systems that Russia has. So they carry these standoff attacks where they're flying quite away from even Syrian airspace. They fire a missile into it, and it's the missile itself that would be in danger of being shot down or not, which is a risk a military is willing to take on that type of strike. American warplanes over Syria are very careful about where they go and what they do. And again, this is out of caution because of the Soviet and Soviet era air defense systems like S-300s and now S-400 that Russia had brought in, and then a much larger array of smaller, shorter range systems, but they're all integrated, and so they're able to communicate with each other, and they're able to decipher what it is that they're seeing. And if they
Yeah.
see something that's as small as a bird, but it's traveling extremely fast, I think they would by now have the software to determine whether that was just some mysterious object or a stealth aircraft. I think they have the ability to do that, and I think it's reflected in the sense of caution that the U.S. and its allies have used in the airspace over Syria. And I think we will see the same in regards to any conflict over Taiwan. And China has equivalent to S-300 systems. They have their own a multitude of other air defense systems and accompanying radars that would all be capable of seeing stealth aircraft. Whether they would be able to identify that tiny cross section as an aircraft, that remains to be seen. But they also have Russian S-400 systems that they've acquired, quite a number of them. I believe all of these systems would be able to identify and pose a significant threat to stealth aircraft.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Brian. I have also read some articles about the S-400s, and I'm seeing a lot of articles where during COVID times, only one battalion of the S-400s was sent to China, and another battalion was on hold. And I'm just wondering whether they are kind of delivering them in secret, because obviously they share a huge border, and the Western papers are not going to kind of pick these up if they are being delivered across the border and stuff. So do you think the Chinese would buy a lot of S-400s, or do you think they would develop their own? Because I'm seeing another report where there's a Chinese system called HQ-19B, and this is the B version. And there's also a HQ-9C version, and they are based on the technology of the S-400. They are not released yet. I believe they're saying that around 2025 they'll be released. But do you think they have adequate enough S-400s in place, or are the Chinese waiting for their own anti-aircraft missiles to come on board? Because I still see the Chinese having a real weak point in the anti-air side of things, because the old S-300 technology is still very old, and I think that's been tested, and you wouldn't be able to bring down the latest F-35s, for example. What are your thoughts on that?
As far as the delivery of S-400 systems, I do believe they received all of them. And I saw this same rumor that you're talking about, and it came from a very small circle of sources, many of them Indian media. And that's not to paint with broad brushes, because some Indian media is actually very, very balanced and professional, but a lot of it is very unreliable, very, lockstep with Western war propaganda, and they're constantly trying to create some sort of rift between China and Russia, just like the US is. So I think that story was propaganda. I don't think there was any truth to it. As far as I know, all of the systems that were ordered were delivered. I think it was 2 units that were sent. I mean, 2 battalion or regiment. I don't remember which one, but I mean that's significant. Either way, it's a significant number of systems. And then yes, China has their own version of the S-300 that they developed from the Russian S-300. So they're capable of getting these systems and then developing them. And oftentimes they do this in cooperation with Russia. So there's no doubt that eventually they will be producing their own version of the S-400 and any subsequent system that Russia develops.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. The next unit, I wanted to talk about Chinese submarines, and I see that as another weak point, because from all of the Western papers I'm reading, they're saying that the Chinese submarines are very noisy, they're easy to pick up, but the latest Chinese submarines, there's articles coming out that they are 80 or 90% quieter than the older versions. I still see that as a weak point, because it's going to take time for China to build up its submarine fleet, and I still think they are way behind the US and even Russia as well, and even other countries like the UK, France, for example. So So what do you think about the Chinese submarines? Do you think they'll make a difference in any battle? I know they have a lot of them. I mean, that might make a difference if you have a lot of submarines, a lot of underwater drones. Then I guess they can kind of overcome any advances. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, they have a significant number of diesel electric submarines, which are very, very quiet. I mean, they have a huge advantage. They have disadvantages, but their huge advantage is that they are very, very quiet. And so I don't think that would be a problem. And the thing is, with modern submarine warfare, we don't really know that much about because there aren't really any examples of it. We have some incidents during the Falklands War on both sides. There were an old Argentine submarine with a poorly trained crew, and they were still creating problems for the Royal British Navy. So that goes to show you that submarines, old, antiquated, poorly trained crew, but it's as long as it's still carrying out its mission, even to a small degree, it's still quite a danger because it's underwater and you have to specifically be looking for it to find it. And even then, it's not that easy to find it and destroy it. And I do believe that the British were trying to destroy it, and they came close, but they failed. And that was a huge mismatch, and the Argentine submarines still managed to survive. So a much larger, more professional, better equipped Chinese submarine fleet, I think, would be a huge threat to the U.S. Navy if it was trying to come in within range of Taiwan in the middle of some sort of conflict. I think it would be a huge threat to the U.S. Navy, in addition to everything else that China has at its disposal.
Sure. I've also read an article where China and Russia are doing this joint program where they're building up some submarines together. And I think that would be a real great help to the Chinese Navy, because they'll obviously get Russian expertise. Because the Russians have been building great submarines ever since the Cold War, and they are very, very quiet, very reliable, very much on a par with the US ones. And I think, yeah, definitely up and coming. But I think China is also focusing more on underwater drones, not quite unmanned underwater drones. And from a story I've recently read, that they are building this underwater base in the South China Sea, which will monitor traffic throughout the South China Sea. They'll be using those islands that they have as well. There's about 7 islands that they have militarized, and and they are setting up all of these posts all under the sea. I've read this report that one of the reasons that one of these US submarines was trying to navigate through the South China Sea, and it hit something. And this is something that the Chinese have actually put in place all over the South China Sea to basically stop other submarines from coming into the sea, because the sea is quite narrow compared to the deep Atlantic or the Pacific. South China Sea is very, very narrow, very shallow at some certain areas. So it's going to be very difficult to navigate through all of these areas and posts. And I'm also seeing another story that the Chinese are building the biggest wind farm ever on the Taiwanese Strait. And that serves a couple of purposes. First of all, if you start building massive wind farms on the Taiwanese Strait, and if you're a submarine trying to navigate through the strait, chances are you'll hit one of them. And I've seen reports that they're putting a lot of these posts and obstacles in place all around the South China Sea. What do you think? Do you think this will make a difference? Is this something you've heard as well, or?
Well, I actually have not looked into any of these stories, but I mean, obviously, at China, Russia, the United States, they have capabilities of monitoring and finding underwater activities, submarines, unmanned drones, naval drones. They have the ability to do this. If you have a permanent base, say in the South China Sea, they would be building up their ability to do that there. With the windmills, I have not heard of that. But if you're doing a lot of building of anything, there's always the possibility of having, some kind of secondary activity going on in and among that. I think building things in the strait, though, I think that's more about reunification, making it
Yeah,
normal to
yeah.
be building things up in a constructive way, things
Mm.
that are close to Taiwan that eventually might benefit Taiwan. So we have to wait and see. We have to be real careful because we know that the United States and the Western media, they make things up. They make things up. They want to try to, make China look as bad as possible, make it like it's some sort of menace to the entire planet, and that it's building up its military because it wants to threaten the rest of the world, not because it's completely surrounded by tens of thousands of U.S. troops, right off their coast, or actually secretly infiltrating into Taiwan itself. So we have to be real careful about that and look into these stories. I did not have time to look into those two stories.
Sure, that's fine. And let's get into the next aircraft, which is the Y-20. And the Y-20 has recently come into um, the kind of crosshairs of the Westerners ever since they delivered some weapons to Serbia. And I believe there was about 3 or 4 Y-20s delivering anti-aircraft missiles to Serbia, and then they kind of went back into China, and that was all over the news. And I think the Westerners were pretty shocked by Chinese capability and how fast they could build that many in a very short space of time. And we've seen a lot of Western YouTubers where they're saying that if there was ever a war in the Taiwanese Strait, the Chinese will be landing their ships on the beaches. It's going to be like Normandy. There's going to be thousands and thousands of casualties. I mean, I don't know what film or what Hollywood movie they've been watching. Maybe Tom Cruise's Saving Private Ryan or something. I mean, they don't know. It doesn't seem like they know anything about modern warfare or anything about the Chinese military or any new, any kind of common sense, because anybody with common sense, we know that that is old style World War II style, landing on the beaches and things like that. And I remember when Pelosi came to Taiwan, and there was clips of Taiwanese soldiers setting up barricades on the beaches, and I'm thinking, you're just wasting time, guys. Because what the Chinese will do now, they got the Y-20 aircraft. They will just fly into Taiwan, start, there's going to be a lot of paratroopers landing all over Taiwan. There's going to be drones flying around. There's going to be missile strikes. There's going to be blockades using the Chinese ships. They've got a lot of tactics that the Chinese could use rather than going into the beach and running into Taiwan from there. I mean, I don't know what kind of military they think the Chinese have. What do you think of that? I mean, that kind of stuff usually makes me kind of laugh.
Yeah, I think we should probably get into that a little bit. I think this guy. People send me clips of his, Peter Zeihan or Zaihai. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but
there's another one as well.
Blinkov's.
Blinkov's Battlefield. It's like a little puppet. There's a glove puppet, and he's talking. Blinkov's Battlefields or something.
So you really just funny. Have to. He was saying something like China would have to use fishing boats. He would use fishing boats to storm the beaches. Do you know how fishing boats work? That you can't really storm the beach with a fishing boat. But that aside, however ridiculous that sounds, I mean, again, Western analysts have admitted that China has the largest missile arsenal, both in size, quantity, and also variety. And the first thing they would do is wipe out any known Taiwanese military. If they made the decision to destroy what the administration's military capabilities, they would take these out with missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. All of these sites would be gone. By the time they decided to put troops actually on the island, you're right. I mean, they could pick to use aircraft, they could use boats, they could do whatever they want because everything else was destroyed, significantly degraded. And they could do blockade, like you said. they don't even have to land on the island because it's an island. You just cut it off from the outside. What do you think is going to happen? Where are they going to get supplies from? How are they going to feed people? How are they going to do anything? You look at the havoc being created by Russian drones right now on the power grid in Ukraine. Just imagine how much worse that would be if Ukraine was an island, right off the coast and so far away from everything, absolutely everything else. So that's what's going to define how China operates. And imagining that they need to somehow storm the beaches like Normandy, it's comical. It really is, and it demonstrates the lack of understanding people have of modern warfare. And we have a modern day conflict unfolding in front of us. Russia using weapon systems very similar to what China has, and people are still not drawing any conclusions or lessons from that and applying it to Taiwan and understanding how different that conflict will be than what, as you say, people think they're thinking Normandy from World War II. It's I don't know what else to say about that. What was the other part of your question, AJ? Because I think there was more to it than that. Oh, the Y-20 in general.
Yeah, Y-20 in general.
Let's talk about the Y-20. I think the Y-20 is a great way to illustrate the intent behind China's military buildup versus the illusions and the threat the Western media is trying to portray it as. So you have a little over 30 Y-20 strategic airlift aircraft built by China. Yes, they use them to deliver weapons to Serbia. They use it to deliver humanitarian aid to places in the Pacific struck by storms and other natural disasters. They use it domestically to bring troops from one part of the country to the other, again, to respond to natural disasters. A little over 30 versus the C-17. The United States has the C-17. It's approximately the same type of, comparable. 220 versus a little over 30. That is the difference between a global hegemon trying to project military power across the globe and a nation with a much larger population and a nation that probably should have more than just a couple, 30 airlift planes like this. But you can see the disparity in numbers right there. And there's a disparity in intent reflected in those numbers. So that's something people should consider. And the Y-20 is proving that it's very capable. It is enhancing China's logistical capabilities, which are very important. But I think ultimately something like that, if we're talking about the conflict in Taiwan, I mean, there's many ways they could transport things by sea, by air. The Y-20 will just enhance that if they decide to use it. And you have to be careful with something like the Y-20. You would not be flying or anywhere near Taiwan until Taiwan's military capabilities were almost completely degraded, especially air defense systems. So it's easy.
Sure.
Yeah.
And also a lot of people don't understand as well. The Y-20, one of the other main reasons is so important is China can support its allies in any war. So say, for example, this Ukraine conflict gets out of hand and NATO and the United States are overrunning Russia and they're about to go into Russia's borders, and Russia's borders is Chinese borders. So obviously China would not want that. They would not want NATO troops and NATO bases right on its borders. So they will probably try and help out Russia in that situation. So things like the Y-20 is very, very important, not just to move troops around, but also to move equipment. And I think a lot of people underestimate how important the Y-20 is as a country, and also to help allies, power projection as well.
Well, I think the main takeaway with China's logistical capabilities, and really it's actually an inability to project significant military power globally. I mean, if somehow NATO overwhelmed Russia and they were moving into Russia, I think China would still have a very, very hard time projecting military power there. I think they would, because, again, we're talking about, you look at the U.S., its ability to move troops around. That's because they have over 200 aircraft like that, and they have many other capabilities as well on a similar scale. Everything involving China and projecting military power beyond its borders is just as small as its number of Y-20s. So we have to keep that in mind. We have to keep that in mind in terms of Russia also. They don't have a huge amount of strategic airlift capabilities or the ability to move huge amounts of military forces by sea. This is one of the main reasons they didn't get involved in Libya the same way they did in Syria. They just simply didn't have the ability to do it. They had to pick and choose. It was a hard decision to make, but they had to pick and choose because it just wasn't practical. So we want there to be a greater balance of power in the world, but we have to be realistic about what Russia and China can actually do versus what sometimes we might wish they could do.
Excellent. So I also want to now come up to one of China's greatest strengths, and if I can just share my screen.
Someone in the comments section mentioned that the Y-20 is also used in a tanker air refueling capability.
Oh yes,
yeah,
that's right.
Also important to keep in mind because they have a huge need for that, and they are developing the Y-20 to do that.
Yeah,
so that was a good point.
Yeah, very good point. So this is one of China's greatest strengths, drones. And recently, there's some pictures and images coming out of China. The J-20 is now basically being surrounded by drones. So you said the J-20. There's a two-seater version, and the two-seater version, one person will be doing all the flying, maybe the attacking, and there's another person on the back seat managing all of the drones. They will be using AI, for example, and it seems that Chinese are now well above what many other countries have got. For example, in UK, they have been developing the 6th generation fighter jet for 20 years now, and one of the major parts of that 6th generation fighter is called the Tempest in UK, and they've spent hundreds of billions on it, and they're still pouring money into it. And one of the major aspects of that airplane, it carries around loads of wingman drones. So these wingman drones, they have various uses. One for surveillance, for scouting, or if there's a couple of missiles heading your way, you just put a couple of wingman drones in front of you. So they're very good for defense purposes as well. They could be a huge game changer. What don't you think, Brian? I mean, if you have one J-20 and with about 10 or so of these wingman drones, that's the equivalent of having 10 F-35 jets. And imagine the money you would save if you can get that
so
configuration
we're talking
working.
about we're talking about the
I'm talking about
the wingman drone concept. So,
you're
absolutely
the wingman drone
right.
concept.
So it would be game changing because if it's implemented successfully, many countries working on this. The United States has their own version. Russia has a wingman drone program for the Su-57, their latest aircraft, and China is developing them as well. You can use them, just as you say, as decoys to absorb enemy fire, for electronic warfare, for surveillance. And you would the Russian Su-57, they will do a two-seater version where the second pilot would be operating the wingman drone. This would be something that would it's called force multiplier. So you have one pilot or two pilots. Now you have these drones that are actually multiplying the amount of force that just these two airmen are able to wield on the battlefield, or I should say above the battlefield. This is something we have to wait and see. But the implications and the potential are major. Just as you say, you're talking about saving money. it takes time and money to train pilots, and if you could expand what a single pilot can do, you're getting more return on your investment, I guess. So I think this is why the U.S., China, Russia, they're all working on it. How close are they to actually implementing something that could be used practically on or above the battlefield? I don't know. These are the kind of things that you have to keep a very close eye on. And when it's finally ready and actually used, I think it'll surprise a lot of people. Just like these Garan 2 drones that Russia is using to dismantle Ukraine's power grid.
Exactly. So I want to bring on the next topic, which is the actual capabilities of the J-20 itself. And obviously, it's still shrouded in secrecy, and we know it's not been tested in any way at all. But one thing I do know about is they're equipped with PL-15 and PL-21 missiles. And if you look at the actual specifications of those missiles go further than what the US has. So in theory, these J-20s could fire further, and if they can find an aircraft which is longer distance, for example, they can fire a couple of these PL-21 missiles rather than. So you got the head start basically, rather than waiting for yourself to come on enemy radars. What do you think about the PL-21 to PL-15, or what do you think about the J-20 itself as well?
Yeah, Chinese air-to-air missiles. Again, we always hear about how China is stealing all of the West's technology, but actually, China has many systems that it has developed that there is no analogy for in among Western forces. So air-to-air missiles. Again, Western analysts admit that yes, they have these missiles that go much further, and in modern warfare, whoever can see the enemy first and fire first has the greatest chance of coming out on top. So you could have the most advanced, you poured over $1 trillion into your F-35 program, but it can't fire as far as Chinese warplanes. Then you have a lot of expensive targets flying in the air. It's as simple as that. But again, this is something we're not going to know until they go up against each other. And one of the things that China and Russia have invested in heavily over decades is anti-access area denial capabilities, air defense systems, and long-range missiles and rocket systems that keep an enemy at bay, far away, at long range, preventing the enemy from moving in. And the U.S. is an aggressor nation, has invested heavily in military aggression, essentially, not defense. China and Russia are able to set up areas that U.S. forces or proxies armed with U.S. weapons simply can't get in there. And we're watching this take place right now in Ukraine. This attrition that's taking place because Russia has these long-range capabilities that Ukraine does not, and how they're able to chip away at a much larger enemy, numerically superior enemy. They're able to chip away at them with this weapons with superior range. This is something that Russia and China have both invested in heavily, and this is something that the U.S. is struggling to try to think of a way of overcoming. The best way to overcome it is to abandon the military doctrine of military aggression. If you're not going to be an aggressor, and if you create similar anti-access area denial systems, then you're protecting your territory, they're protecting their territory, and everyone just leaves each other alone. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, exactly. I was going to come up to the anti-air capabilities now, and one of the things that everyone says is the best form of defense is offense, and it seems like the United States is spending all its money on offensive weapons and sending out its military might throughout the rest of the world. It's got 800 bases or so around the world, but I just feel that they are not putting enough emphasis on defense. United States is a huge country, and I just do not think that they have enough patriots to surround the country. And these patriots are probably going to be old from the Soviet era or the Iraq War era, and they just don't have the capabilities to upgrade them. And if China or Russia sends out its hypersonic missiles, I think United States would be in a serious risk. What do you think about that?
Well, we're seeing this unfold right now in Ukraine. We see the collective West. It's not just the United States. The collective West had this policy for decades to create these offensive systems. Their focus, their obsession on air superiority, fighters that can take over the airspace of any given area, and they're usually going up against countries that don't have air defense systems. What was their plan if they ever went up against a peer or near peer competitor with a formidable air defense system, integrated air defense system? Apparently they didn't think about that because they have no answer to it. And you see them talking about, well, we need to send our air defense systems to Ukraine. What are they sending? They're sending stuff that hasn't even been built yet. They're still in the process of developing it. They're sending, they're refurbishing antiquated systems that may or may not work, but definitely will not come in the quantities necessary to make any difference anyway. And like you were talking about the Patriot, and a couple of people in the comment section have been pointing it out. Yes, exactly. On the screen right now, Patriot missile doesn't even work. Ask Saudi Arabia how well the Patriot missile system works.
Yeah.
And even if it was working, they don't have enough interceptors to supply it with. So they were running out of interceptors. They asked the United States for more. They don't have the capability to make them quick enough. So they told Saudi Arabia to ask other Persian Gulf nations to look in their inventories if they had any to spare, to please send to Saudi Arabia. So you can see a huge problem developing, and this is just among America and its proxy wars. This isn't even, we're not even talking about a direct conflict between the United States or Russia or China, which I think is good because it'll hopefully discourage the U.S. from even contemplating this type of direct conflict with either or both nations. Which really, I mean, it really seems like the U.S. wants a conflict with Russia and China at the same time. I don't think it's going to work out too well for these reasons specifically.
Exactly, Brian. I completely agree with you. And just to reiterate what you said, these Patriots were supposed to protect Saudi Arabian oil fields, and the number of times these drones have actually gone past these Patriots hit Saudi Arabian oil fields. And this is one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia is really angry at United States. MBS is really angry at him. And I think Biden at one point, they were so useless that the Saudi Arabians had said to US, your Patriots are pretty much useless. They're not working. Our sites are still getting attacked. And what did Biden do? He decided to take them all off. Instead of being embarrassed even further, he decided to kind of, you know what, we'll, if you think they're useless, we'll just take them back, shall we? And he took them all off. And it's just one of those things. But also, I wanted to kind of reiterate the fact that the United States has never really been tested. And if you look at all the wars, all the recent wars, Syria, they don't really have an effective air force to really test these Patriot missiles or test the military. And I think the funding for the United States has gone on to other more offensive weapons rather than these defensive, because they thought that, if we, these Patriots are not being tested. We're the sole hegemony in this world. There's no country that can actually test us. We're more about offense rather than defense. And is this like a very arrogant way of thinking, or is this a huge mistake that the United States are doing? I mean, just focusing on offense and not focusing enough on defense. What are your thoughts on that?
You're right, and it's a completely unsustainable way to do foreign policy. It's a lot like when you look at Wall Street, you look at investors that are just trying to maximize profits, and they take over a company and they run it into the ground, trying to wring every cent out of it. Yep. And that's kind of what these same type of people are doing to the entire country on a geopolitical level. during the Vietnam. So we're asking, has the U.S. hasn't really even been tested during the Vietnam War? They were going up against somewhat advanced air defense systems that were given to Vietnam, and they lost something like 10,000 aircraft and helicopters throughout the entire conflict. That is a huge number of losses. They were doing these missions to try to they called Wild Weasel, where they try to scare air defense systems into turning off their radars, because they have anti-radiation missiles that home in on the radar sets. And actually, this was the HARM missile that the U.S. sent to Ukraine, trying to achieve the same result. And it really, it's had mixed results. It was an extremely dangerous mission, and considering how many aircraft the U.S. lost, you could pretty much see that it didn't really help them much. When they go up against a peer or a near peer adversary, they're going to have these same problems. They have, throughout their history, been trying to pick conflicts that they were fairly confident they could win. Going into Iraq, they really inflated the threat the Iraqi army posed. They were billing it as, it's the fourth largest army in the world, and maybe on paper it was, but in terms of capabilities, they had antiquated weapon systems. They had an air defense system that was dysfunctional. They had all of these problems, and it was something that allowed the United States to really kind of just knock them over. They would not be able to have done that if Iraq had somewhat modern weapons, or even with their air defense systems that they had, if they had just organized it a little better, coordinated better, trained better, there would have been a totally different outcome. And the United States is out of countries like that to pick on. Now all that's left are nations that are actually able to defend themselves. And so it really is changing. It's changing the paradigm. The United States had this window of opportunity where it wanted to assert itself as a sole global hegemon, and that window has closed. And they've painted themselves into this corner where they cannot just get along with everyone. They're still trying to fight everyone all at the same time. And just as you say, because they've focused for decades on the wrong strategy militarily, strategically, in terms of developing the type of weapon systems it would need to win the wars of tomorrow, there's really nothing that they can do. This is why I was listening to a conversation. I think it was Richard Medhurst, and he had on Scott Ritter, and they were talking about U.S. nuclear doctrine. And the U.S. is trying to readopt, I guess, a nuclear doctrine where no one is really sure when the U.S. would use its nuclear weapons. They wouldn't necessarily use them in defense. They would possibly use them even during a conventional conflict. I mean, have you heard about this, AJ? Especially President Biden talking about this. Hello. Can people still hear me? I think AJ disappeared.
Oh no! Oh, sorry, I was on mute.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, yes, I definitely heard this on the news. I haven't investigated further, but yeah, I was actually going to bring it up with you maybe later on. But yeah,
and they're doing that they're doing this out of desperation, out of frustration and desperation. Because they're trying to achieve something they don't have the means to do. Just like in Ukraine, they don't have the means to accomplish what they're trying to achieve, and they keep falling back to increasingly desperate options, which have an even less likelihood of working.
Yeah, I mean, during the Soviet Union times, during the Cold War, you would think that the United States had a pretty good defense at the time because they were in a Cold War, but now I just do not think the United States is in a position to threaten nuclear war with Russia and China, because I don't think they have enough means or defenses to protect themselves, and I think this is a major problem. And I don't know if it's arrogance or stupidity or a bit of both, really, because yeah, it's one of those things. They're not even thinking about the impact that if somebody actually fires back or does something back or hits you back. They're not even thinking about that. They're just going out there thinking, oh, we can do whatever the hell we want, and that kind of attitude,
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. And look again, look at what's unfolding in Ukraine. It's almost
yeah,
as if they didn't really think Russia was going to call their bluff and go into Ukraine, but they did.
exactly.
Then they tried to hit Russia with sanctions. This idea in their head they thought was going to work. It didn't really work, and now they really don't know what to do. And again, they just become more and more desperate, and the things that they're trying to do become more and more self-destructive. It's impacting them much worse than their adversaries.
Exactly. I was going to bring up this super chat. Will Ukraine suffer the same fate as Vietnam if US NATO enter the conflict and directly face the Russians? Well, you can't really compare Vietnam with Ukraine. They're completely different armies, different motivations, different reasons why they're in war. But I think he's trying to probably mention whether Ukraine will be completely destroyed like Vietnam was, because Vietnam had there's numbers like 12 million bombs that got dropped in Vietnam, and still to this day they are still picking up these unexploded bombs, and I believe 30% of the country is still unoccupied because they are still clearing out bombs in Vietnam. There's still a lot of people born disabled in Vietnam as well with the use of Agent Orange and things like that. So it does affect generations. If it completely destroys your country. Um, but I don't see that with Ukraine. I think Ukraine is more likely to collapse before then, and I do not think US and NATO would be stupid enough to join this conflict because this is a severe escalation. What do you think, Brian?
I would never bet against increased stupidity among the West. I mean, especially with what we've seen up until now. I heard Alexander Micuris from the Duran actually was uh, giving a very carefully formulated comparison between what could transpire in Ukraine and what had transpired in Vietnam. The way the U.S. incrementally got itself involved in the conflict, the mission creep, if you will, and how we know now because the U.S. is admitting it that they've got these inspectors in Ukraine, and how easily they could try to continue to expand that until they pretty much are fighting the conflict on behalf of Ukraine. And we see a lot of people suggesting that that's pretty much already the case. NATO is already fighting the conflict for Ukraine on their behalf, and you just have these Ukrainian soldiers in uniforms, but everything else, the command, the control, logistics, everything, and to a greater degree, these mercenaries that are being brought in are fighting the conflict. So it's hard to say, but again, just like in Vietnam, it was a losing battle from the very beginning, and I think it is the very same for Ukraine. So the U.S. can continue to escalate, but it's not going to change the outcome because they just don't have the ability to accomplish what they're trying to achieve there. Fighting a proxy war across an ocean against a nuclear armed superpower, right? That's operating right over its own border. I mean, it's logistics, it's common sense.
Exactly. And going back into Taiwan, Taiwan is, like you said, is a completely different kettle of fish. It's an island, and one of the things that Ukraine is surviving on military and as well as money coming across the borders, is coming from Odessa as well, coming via Poland. So the West can carry on arming, Ukraine until Russia blocks the border somehow, unless they take over all of Ukraine. But that's not going to happen in Taiwan because any ships that try to come near Taiwan in any conflict, China would be using those DF-17s, DF-21 hypersonic missiles, and they'll be completely blown out the water. And I'm pretty sure the US knows about this. I don't think they'll be stupid enough to do that. The only country that'll be stupid enough to do that would be the British, and I wouldn't put it past them. I remember I remember a story about a British ship going up the Yangtze River, and he got sunk by the Chinese, and I was reading the history about it. But you know, but I wouldn't put it past them. And I was thinking about this movie I saw a couple of months ago. It's called Idiocracy, and Idiocracy is basically about this guy who gets put into some sort of time freeze, and he wakes up 100 years later, and he realizes the whole world has gone dumb. The world leaders have gone stupid. And if you look at that film right now, it's exactly how we are right now. I just feel that the leaders we had back in the day, 50, 60 years ago, even when Reagan was there, I mean, a lot of people at the time thought Reagan was stupid. He was just a film star, film actor. But compare him to what we have now, it's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, you have to see that film. You haven't seen it, it's worth watching. But,
Oh,
it's a
I have
scary
seen
thought
it.
how the
Yeah.
world is just, yeah, it's a scary thought how the world is becoming dumber and dumber, and the leaders we're having are just getting more and more stupid by the day. I mean, would you put that down to? Is it social media? Is it just it's just people are just not interested in spreading their knowledge. They're more interested in reality TV crap, and I just don't know what's going on with the world. What do you think? What do you
Well,
think that is, Brian?
Regarding the West's leadership, many of them are people who have not earned their place. They were given their place because of who their parents were or who they knew, and they're not in these positions of power because of merit. You have these corporations shaping U.S. foreign policy, Western foreign policy. And again, these are the same type of people on Wall Street that buy up companies, wring them dry of profits, discard them, and start over. They're doing the same thing. They're doing the same thing to the countries in the West. They're not choosing a sustainable strategy to move forward. They are obsessed with constant expansion of power and profit, and you cannot sustain that. It's like any kind of pyramid scheme, Ponzi scheme. It has a limit. When it reaches that, that's it, and they're reaching that limit, and people are starting to push back. And so why are they like this? Again, I think it's you look at their backgrounds. They do not have a background in real work. They've been career politicians, and they live in an increasingly isolated world echo chamber that they and their media are creating, to the point where they start believing their own lies, maybe to a certain extent. I think it also has to do a lot with just the premise that they're operating on. The United States is operating on a premise that it should be number one in the world. It's obvious. They even say it. I mean, President Joe Biden has said this in speeches, that the U.S. is not going to allow China to surpass the United States, not during his administration. And what you're saying is China, a country with 4 or 5 times the population of the U.S., world-class infrastructure, a huge education system, pumping out millions more graduates in relevant fields, contributing to technology, economics, and military power. Somehow they're not going to surpass the U.S. Based on what? What is the basis you're going off of? How are you going off of that? It's because they really honestly buy into Western superiority. You could even say there's a racial component to it. They just believe that Asian people are inferior. I argue, this is the year 2022. I've argued with people who honestly think that Chinese people can't innovate. They don't have any creativity. And this is, the hard ingrained stereotype that people have been raised to believe. It's simply not true. It's demonstrably not true. So they are starting with an immensely flawed premise of white supremacy, of Western supremacy, and they are looking at a world that by every metric is surpassing them, and they just simply refuse to believe that it's possible that they can do that, and they believe that it's possible for them to maintain their grip over the planet, which it isn't. So if you're starting from a premise rooted in fantasy, it can only become more and more distorted as you progress. And I think that is also a huge contributing factor to this, this deterioration of reason, logic, rational decisions that we see the West making. A lack of rational decisions that the West is making.
Exactly. So let's move on to the next military unit, and I'm sure you'll know a lot about this. Is the aircraft carriers that the Chinese have had, and recently they've released a brand new aircraft carrier, and I believe there's 3 more in progress. The next one is going to be a nuclear based. And I think I've also read that the Chinese have said that would be it. They're not going to build any more because they are not about power projection. They are not about spreading it through the rest of the world. All they want is to protect their supply lines. And so yeah, they want to stay as a green water navy. Obviously, the US is a blue water navy with 800 bases around the world, and I can imagine how expensive it is to maintain those 800 bases as well. And so my question is, are those aircraft carriers safe, Brian? Because I'm pretty sure that the United States will definitely target them, and they'll target them in ways. They'll probably send missiles either from South Korea or from Japan, which would put those countries at risk. Um, they could be sent via long-range missiles. They could be used. The United States can use the B-21 bombers as well. There are various means and submarines. Do you think those Chinese aircraft carriers at risk, and how do you think the Chinese will be able to protect them?
I think China will probably just keep them far back. I don't think they're going to use them the same way the United States uses them. I think there's some necessity to be able to move a base of operations for aircraft around the ocean. That can be very useful, but I don't think that it's something that China is going to base its doctrine around like the U.S. has. So I think the centrality of the aircraft carrier for China will not be there the same way as it is for the U.S. How will they protect it? I think they will keep it, behind their integrated air defense system.
Yeah.
Will they still be vulnerable? Because what it would be political. If you knocked out all of China's aircraft carriers, I still think they would be capable of defending themselves, their territory. So it's not as important for China as it is for the United States to protect, because that's their primary tool, projecting power around the world. That and their military bases overseas, and that is something that I think its time has come and passed, where China's missile arsenal, for example, could target any U.S. aircraft carrier group, the whole group coming anywhere close to China during a conflict. I think would be folly, and even the United States, in its planning for war with China, realizes this. And like you say, blue water navy, green water navy, some people might not know what that means. Blue water navy means you can operate anywhere around the world. Green water means you're pretty much sticking to your shores, near your territory. So again, it's another indicator of who's actually the problem here. If China has a green water navy, this means they have no aspirations to project military power around the globe. The United States demonstratively does this right now as we're speaking. So again, it just shows you the difference in the approaches here. What the United States has said they would do is choke maritime trade to and from China very far away from where China has its military capabilities concentrated. And I don't really know how China would go about dealing with that. I think there are things they could do to make life very difficult for the U.S. if they decided to do that. They're also investing heavily on the Belt and Road Initiative, which is overland conduit, transit lines, which is also the northern route that goes north of Russia. That maybe would be a viable way for China to move goods. I don't know. That's, again, it's all speculation, but this is something that the U.S. has had their think tanks begin preparing for, and that this is what they've come up with.
Yeah, talking about think tanks, we'll have a discussion about that think tank video that came out on CNBC in a bit later on. And let me throw this at you, Brian. Say there is evidence that China is building a hypersonic glide vehicle which can kind of fly around the world and target anyone, anything. And say, for instance, they use this glide vehicle to destroy a couple of nuclear aircraft carriers. Would that be an escalation into nuclear war? Because if you destroy a nuclear aircraft carrier, obviously that's going to create a massive nuclear explosion. We'll be sending out radiation everywhere. Guaranteed, everybody will die, and not just getting blown up, but you'll sink. And if you do survive, you'll be, obviously covered with radiation. Do you think that would be an escalation into nuclear war if that happens? If China does manage to sink one of the U.S. Navy's nuclear aircraft carriers?
I think if China was thinking about doing something like that, it would be because things have gotten so far out of control that would be the next logical step toward escalation, which is why I think when we're talking about what's going to happen in Ukraine between the U.S. and Russia and what's going to happen between the U.S. and China, I mean, the U.S. is getting desperate. They're doing very reckless things, but you have watched Russia and China be very measured in what they do in response, because they don't want it to escalate out of control. They don't want this. They don't want to be destroying nuclear powered ships or submarines and spreading radiation. They don't want a nuclear exchange. They're trying to avoid this at all costs. A lot of what I think is going on with Taiwan is China sees these blatant provocations by the U.S. and they're trying to ignore them because they know time is on their side. They're not running out of time. The U.S. is. They know that eventually, inevitably, Taiwan is going to be fully reunified with the rest of China. It's the U.S. that's out of time. This is why they're becoming more and more desperate. Their provocations. I really don't know what it would take to get China to react that way, but I think they would try to resist for as long as possible, even if it meant suffering humiliation. As long as they felt they would still come out in the long run on top, I think they would be willing to suffer that humiliation for the sake of not escalating it towards something catastrophic.
Yeah, I'm just thinking it would probably happen in a number of situations. Number one, the US would probably want to escalate things. They'll want to get everyone behind a war with China, and this would be a very good trigger. Like, for example, Pearl Harbor was a very good trigger for them to go at war with the Japanese. So if for instance, China was trying to blockade Taiwan, and they've sent out a warning to the whole world, do not come near us or we will blow you out the water. This is between us and Taiwan to sort out peacefully. We don't want war. And then suddenly you see a couple of aircraft carriers coming from the United States saying, sorry, we do not agree with this blockade. We are going to intervene. And say US probably wants this war to escalate, so they can send a couple of aircraft carriers, they get sunk, and he brings the whole United States population behind the government, and they literally go to war with China. I mean, I've seen that done before previously in other wars, previous wars, the second Iraq war, for instance, with all those lies, and they used 9/11 as well as a pretext as well as other lies. Do you think that could happen in this situation?
I think they're almost counting on it. When you really think about the 2003 invasion, based on an absolute lie, at a certain point, they began justifying it because of all of the U.S. soldiers that had died in Iraq as part of this illegal invasion. They said, well, Iraqis are killing our soldiers. Okay, we invaded illegally. It was all a lie. Okay, but look, now we've got all these U.S. soldiers dying. So what are you anti-American or something? We have to answer to this. So this is what they use to continue justifying year after year of being in Iraq. They're still in Iraq to this day. But considering that they're still in Iraq, but Iraq it's a very complicated situation right now. And I think maybe something similar would happen in regards to Taiwan. I really think that China will be very reluctant to use military force on Taiwan. I think they'd be very reluctant to do that. And then I
Yeah.
think they would be very reluctant to get into some sort of armed conflict with the United States. The United States knows this. At the same time, I think China is building up its capabilities to make it in such a way that if the U.S. did try to intervene, the cost would be so heavy. They also realized, just as we were just saying, that if it does end up in armed conflict, they don't want the American people rallying behind U.S. leadership because the U.S. provoked something and then U.S. sailors died and now everyone is behind it. It gets so complicated and hard to predict what will happen, because you would reason that a similar case could be made for the U.S. to intervene in Ukraine, yet so far they haven't.
Yeah.
They haven't. So, and the same with Syria. The U.S. has been very careful with its presence in Syria in regards to Russia's presence there, and they've tried to avoid escalating into direct conflict there. So it's really hard to say. And each year that goes by, the U.S. is going to its strength, its economic and military strength will wane in relation to China's and China's allies. And so the eventually, I think what will happen is we'll reach a point where it's not even going to make sense for the U.S. to be pushing for independence or whatever it is they're trying to push in Taiwan. It's not even going to make sense at a certain point, and they'll just have to abandon it, just like they had to abandon Afghanistan, and how they're kind of they're just sitting around in Iraq, no real purpose. Iraq is trying to kind of move on beyond the United States. There's a lot of pieces in motion there. Iraq is making deals with other countries, China, Russia, even while the U.S. is occupying their territory. So it's a complicated mess, but that's how empire declines. It declines and it fades. It doesn't just collapse overnight. So it's a, as some people are saying in the comment section, China's playing the long game.
Exactly, and it's a very huge expense. We're talking about over $1 trillion to maintain this military, and I just do not think it's sustainable, especially with the huge economic costs the United States is going through right now with the recession. I just do not think that paying $1 trillion to the military is sustainable long term, and this is getting more and more expensive because you got to pay for maintenance, you got to pay for all of these bases. The salaries need to increase. Obviously, there's many other costs that's involved, ongoing costs, and I just do not think it's sustainable. One of these days, it's just all gonna collapse, like the Soviet Union did. The whole there were so many when the Soviet Union collapsed. All of their military, all of their military just kind of went missing, didn't it? I mean, there was a lot of it in Ukraine that went missing, a lot of it in other countries, former Soviet countries, that they've not just went missing, but they've used it and they've kept it. And I can see that happening. If the US ever collapses, there'll be a lot of countries that'll be gaining a lot of US military units for free. Going back to the shipping side for the Chinese, there's also obviously they are building other ships, and they're building these ships at a really fast rate, and they're almost like they're building 3 or 4 ships to one ship that's being built in the United States. And already the Chinese have got more military ships in service than the US has. But in tonnage, obviously, the United States has a larger tonnage because they've got all of these aircraft carriers. One of the ships that is quite interesting, I thought, is the 075 amphibious ship, and that holds helicopters, and obviously they can land into Taiwan in the future, but they can also be used as mini aircraft carriers as well. So I think a lot of people don't understand. Well, they underestimate the capability of those 075s. Have you seen them, and do you think there'll be any use in any future conflict in the Taiwanese Strait?
Well, these are useful for a multitude of reasons. If China, they're claiming these areas in the South China Sea, it would be essential to have these type of ships this capability to reinforce anywhere very quickly. I mean, there's many more reasons to have it than just going into Taiwan. It would help definitely if you were trying to land on Taiwan, if there was this major military conflict, and after China had used its missile and rocket forces, blockaded the island, and then it was time to land troops. Yes, this would be very useful. And this is a capability that most large nations with large militaries have to have. You see Russia developing similar capabilities. United States obviously has and the UK, they have this capability. So yeah. This, let me see, this comment on the screen. Why doesn't China go into Taiwan now? No, it's again because Taiwan is part of China. These are Chinese people.
Yeah.
And they don't want to go. They don't want a conflict. They don't want to destroy Taiwan. A lot of business takes place between Taiwan and the rest of China. Their economies are virtually integrated already. This is what makes the idea of separatism so ridiculous that the U.S. is backing.
10 years ago, nobody was talking about Taiwan, but you have to understand the history of it. They have been, Taiwan has been in the crosshairs because Trump brought it up during his trade war with China. Then everyone started talking about it. But yeah, Taiwan has always been part of China, and even the Taiwanese people believe that they are the main China. I mean, their country think that they are the sole kind of leaders. They control all of China. And in the earlier days, Taiwan used to sit on the UN table representing all of China as well. So the one China policy is for both sides. The Taiwanese believe that everything is one China, not just the mainland, but Taiwan is as well. And the same thing, the mainland believes Taiwan is part of China. So they both agreed to it. They both believe in the same thing.
What's interesting, AJ, is the fact that a lot of people that are arguing with me about Taiwan, they don't even know that. They don't know that, and it's not their fault because they read the Western media, and this is how concerted lies are across the Western media. They really do make it out as if Taiwan is some independent country, which it is not. Not even the separatists in Taipei think that the island of Taiwan is its own independent country. They're thinking about possibly declaring it that, but right now it isn't. Even they admit it. Even their constitution right now, it says that Taiwan is a province in larger China. And as a matter of fact, the regime in Taipei has a much larger claim of territory, both on land and at sea, than Beijing, than the People's Republic of China, which a lot of people don't know. They're complaining about the 9-dash line, and Taipei actually has a couple of extra dashes there that they're claiming part of the sea near Vietnam that Beijing actually conceded to Vietnam. So, and nobody knows this because the Western media doesn't tell anybody. And this is why there's so much confusion over it and why no one understands it. But this is what allows the U.S. to perpetuate this policy because no one understands what's going on. So they're doing this kind of in the dark with the media's help.
Yeah, one of the most funniest thing I found is the Western media. Every time the Chinese airplanes going to the ADIZ, they said, "Oh, they're flying into Taiwanese airspace." But if you look at the ADIZ, the majority of it is the sea, and then you got parts of it that goes into the Chinese mainland. So even if they fly over the Chinese mainland, they're saying that these Chinese airplanes have gone over the ADIZ. They're basically going into Taiwanese airspace and stuff, but they don't realize that part of it is basically drawn by the United States to go into the Chinese mainland. I just find that absolutely ridiculous, funny.
Yeah, and the ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, by definition, has to be set up beyond your own actual airspace. So if Taiwan was a country, which it isn't, but let's pretend that it was, it would have its internationally recognized airspace, and then the ADIZ would be beyond that in international airspace, and everyone would have to agree to recognize it because it's not recognized under international law. There is no recognition of an ADIZ under international law. It's just something that nations would agree to the whole purpose is because modern day aircraft travel so quickly, you want to give yourself extra time to identify something so that there is no mistake with your integrated air defense systems. That's the theory behind it. The ADIZ for Taiwan, you know, their claimed airspace, it overlaps China's actual territory, the mainland, and it's completely in international airspace. So it, you know, when and the Western media occasionally they'll mention that buried somewhere deep in the article, but most of the time they don't. And this is why people think that, you know, evil China is invading poor Taiwan's airspace, and they don't know anything about the background. And this is how insidious these lies are. When you see people, I have this problem all the time. People say, Brian, you're absolutely right about Ukraine, but how could you possibly support China? Who told you that China is bad and you should be afraid of it? The exact same people lying to you about Ukraine. And I cannot believe that there are people out there, and I believe that they're real, genuine people that cannot differentiate these. You know, they're being told lies about Ukraine. They recognize that. The exact same people tell them something about China, they believe it. Why? Why is that? I don't know.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. Yeah, I've noticed that in my channel. They'll absolutely believe everything I say about Ukraine. They'll believe, you know, the people like yourself. They'll believe Duran. They'll believe George Galloway. Everything, all the lies about Ukraine. They'll acknowledge it's all lies. But when it comes to China, it's like no, it's the truth. You know, it's the truth, and you know they'll believe the Western media.
They don't hear themselves echoing. Yeah, they don't hear themselves echoing the U.S. State Department, and they don't stop and wonder, wait a minute, why am I repeating the U.S. State Department? What is wrong with this picture? They never ask themselves that question.
Exactly. I'm going to come to the final military hardware for the Chinese, and I think this is definitely one of the main strengths. I talked about the wingman earlier, but I didn't actually go into the actual drone warfare. And according to the numbers, China has got hundreds and thousands of drones ready to go in an eventual conflict, and they have DJI, which is, you know, it's got a military wing as well, and that's generating thousands per month of military drones. China has got things called the swarm drones, and they put them up into ships where they can be launched as swarms, and they will kind of overcome any defense, and most of them are they use remotely, and they use AI as well. And a lot of people don't realize that China uses a lot of AI in a lot of their drone technology. I mean, is this the future of warfare? And I just think that drone warfare is definitely the future of warfare, and that can easily win you or lose you a battle with the most minimum cost of human life as possible. What do you think of that? And the rise of AI,
well,
obviously.
Yes. Well, we have to be real careful about AI because that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah,
but we can look at how central drones have been to the ongoing warfare in Ukraine. We can see that, and even in Syria, maybe to a lesser extent, because there's so much disparity between these proxy forces the U.S. has been backing and Russian and Syrian forces. But in Ukraine, we can see both sides using drones. We can see the advantage Russia has because it's able to bring in all of these additional drones, how important it is to, you know, for targeting, like artillery. You have your artillery, your rockets, your missiles, how important it is to find targets, to guide munitions to targets, and then using the drones themselves as munitions. This is something that is going to gain traction because it's cheaper than something like, say, a cruise missile. You can make many more of them. So instead of counting on that one cruise missile getting through, or a handful of them and just one or two getting through, you can have so many more drones for the same cost. And many more of them, I do believe, will get through because it's going to be hard. I think what we're eventually going to see is...
Sorry.
Okay, getting that ready.
Yeah, getting ready.
So you see these swarms. I think what's going to happen is you're going to have swarms of drone systems that will try to intercept the incoming drones. It's going to be an arms race, and China is definitely positioned to win that war because that arms race, because of the human resources China has available, the fact that they graduate millions more every single year in fields that will contribute to a better outcome in terms of developing drone technology for commercial purposes and also military purposes. If you look at some DJI systems, some of the higher end systems, they are incredibly sophisticated. And I was looking at some of these, how they network the drones and they automate all of these processes.
Yeah.
If you applied that to a military application, that would be scary. And I don't know what anyone would do to stop that. And I was even thinking about what if you really did have to stop, say, like these Garan 2 drones, what would you do? And I think it would be swarms of counter drones. I don't know. Again, this is something to keep a very close eye on.
Yeah, I mean, the Ukraine war has shown that, especially with these suicide drones that Russia is using against Ukraine, they've been very, very effective, because you, as a country, you don't know whether to shoot them down. And number one, if you shoot them down, you're wasting rockets. First of all, you're wasting ammunition. Secondly, you got to compare the price it costs for the drone and the price it costs for the rockets. It's all about economics. War is economics. You got to make sure you do more damage to your opponent in a cheaper way. So if you're using a $10,000 drone and this rocket costs $100,000, but you are still winning economically, because it doesn't matter if they shoot down the drone, you can replace that with 9 others for the same price. So it's come to a point where, and also if you shoot down a drone, you're also giving away your position as well. So if you're an anti-aircraft missile and you shoot down a drone, you're easily giving away your position, and then you're a target. Secondly, these drones, you've seen in Ukraine where you see officers and police officers and army units are trying to shoot them down with their machine guns. So they don't know whether to shoot them down with missiles, or they don't know whether to shoot them down with machine guns. Absolutely scary. And imagine, this is just 1 or 2 drones that Russia is using. But imagine if there's thousands swarming across your city, and the havoc they would cause. You would not have enough missiles to take them all down, first of all. And secondly, the amount of havoc, and if all of these drones have got onboard missile systems, they'll be taking down military units and armored vehicles and anti-aircraft units. You could literally, if you can do this well, you can take over Taiwan with 0 losses, human losses, if China can kind of do that well. But I think we're still a few years away from that. But I think definitely, like you said, they've got the capability to produce these at a very large scale. And yeah, it's quite interesting to see, actually. I think this is definitely the way we're going. They call it the 4th Industrial Revolution, and the 4th Industrial Revolution is all about drone warfare and also augmentation. Yeah, have you read about the 4th Industrial Revolution, Brian? It's about soldiers.
That is a mix of different economic concepts. I do believe how it would impact military, because they're talking about like distributed manufacturing, AI, like designing systems and things like that. I think we would have to kind of focus on that. Could be a focus for an upcoming episode, because there's so
definitely
much. But just think about China, their industrial capacity just to manufacture, but also their capacity to research, develop, and for the product, before you start manufacturing, manufacturing something. So I mean, they have the advantage. If drone warfare is the future, then China definitely has the advantage. And again, this is something that the U.S. is they have no way of leveling this playing field, because they're just outnumbered. And the best way would be to accept a balance of power among nations and to cooperate and compete in a healthy way, but they just can't. So they'll have to learn the hard way, unfortunately.
Sure. Now we're coming up to the second part of the show, and this video has been around for a long time, and I made a video to make fun out of it, but I want to kind of quickly go over it with you. And these are supposed to be some of the most intelligent think tanks the United States has, and I did some research on this team, and this team was managed by Victoria Nuland. So you can imagine. You can imagine what kind of people are behind it, and these are think tanks which actually tell the U.S. Leadership what to do, and they advise the current administration. It's quite scary how they advise them, because these guys literally have no clue. I'm not going to go through the whole video. I'll just take in certain aspects, and I'll probably go to the parts where it's important, but the rest of it I'll just skim through it. What I'll do is... So this is the team, by the way. And first of all, you have a think tank wearing a pink uniform. I mean, can anyone actually take this guy seriously?
Well, yeah, I mean, I won't judge them based on how they're dressed. But what I will say is that a lot of these people, in a way, though, it does kind of reflect how disconnected they are from reality. It kind of manifests itself in the way they present themselves. They have what is their background? I think they might have had like this entire segment. They might have had one or two people who are ever in the military, but most of them never served in the military. So what do they know about warfare? I just don't
exactly.
get it.
And these guys actually genuinely giving advice to the administration, and it's quite scary the kind of stuff they come up with. I think this is the only guy who actually speaks sense, and he's got military background, but the rest of them are pretty useless. And the things they say as well, I mean, this lady. I'm not even going to start with this lady. This lady's suggestion. I mean, there's two teams, right? There's one team which is the Chinese team, and the other team is the US, and she's part of the Chinese team. And at one point she talks about China releasing nukes as a warning shot.
Yeah. Or I think they suggested taking out American bases in Okinawa and Guam as their starting move. Why would you ever do that? Because this is an internal affair, unless the United States was already somehow directly involved. Why would you launch a first strike against the United States? So again, it's something like this is an exercise in rattling the public's cage, really, just to scare them about China. Sure. Just another excuse to scare them in regards to China, portray them as violent, irrational, unpredictable, when in reality they have been beyond patience this entire time against numerous blatant provocations from the United States.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see what they say as well. Can you hear that? Can you hear it, by the way?
Before they get out, because otherwise we know exactly where they're going, which is toward Taiwan to start shooting at us.
By hitting them in the ports, you are guaranteeing that Japan is going to enter the conflict. Not sure that we can.
Would you rather take the American military station in Japan out to the greatest degree possible and have Japan enter the conflict, or let it steam toward Taipei, attack us, and have Japan maybe stay out of the conflict? Those are the two options.
You're going to attack Japan?
We are going to attack U.S. facilities on Japan. So U.S. air bases and U.S. ports that the U.S. uses in Japan. We are not yet going after Japanese air bases.
Part of this is communicating. You're not just taking on this little, rogue island that you see as your own, Taiwan. You're taking on the United States, Japan, Australia.
I'm sort of in the camp of let's be as aggressive as possible, short of launching a preemptive strike, if that makes sense.
Regardless of which course of action the Chinese Red Team takes here, if we are prepared for the bigger fight, the potential large strike campaign, we are better off than if we assume that there's going to be a blockade or a lower level fight and then suddenly find ourselves in a much bigger war.
The insight that comes from this is you have to have a peacetime posture that allows you to be prepared to deter on day zero and fight if deterrence doesn't work.
All right, Stacey, high level
this
here.
is really funny.
What just happened with Move 1?
China's invaded Taiwan. It began by attacking Taiwan's outlying islands near the mainland. Then it followed it with a large air and missile strike on Taiwan and on U.S. bases in Japan and on U.S. bases in Guam and the Northern Marianas. In response to that, the United States followed up with bomber attacks on Chinese ships in port, and there was an air battle over Taiwan where American aircraft flying from the Philippines came in and engaged in combat with Chinese aircraft that were trying to bomb Taiwan.
So after Move 1, can you assess which team is winning?
I think it's a stalemate right now. China has strategically blundered by pulling Japan in, and the United States is still well positioned to defend, but China also has a lot of its assets left and has a lot of power that it can apply.
Can you pause it for just a moment?
This is absolutely hilarious. Go on,
so
Brian.
they're talking about like dogfights over Taiwan. Look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. Russia is not, flying their aircraft over Ukraine right now because Ukraine has air defense systems. Taiwan has air defense systems. They might not be the best in the world, but they have them. China's not going to be flying their warplanes over Taiwan. They have a huge missile arsenal. If it ever came down to this, huge missile arsenal, their multiple launch rocket systems are so long range and precise they could hit anything on Taiwan. And their air defense systems, their integrated air defense systems can hit, the shortest range missiles that they have, for say their S-400 systems, could cover the entire strait and parts of the island. The longer range missiles can cover everything on the island and beyond. So they don't need to have their aircraft flying around Taiwan. If the United States were to send aircraft anywhere near that theater of operation, they would risk being shot down by China's integrated air defense system. Just to put that, how unrealistic all of this is. And the idea of China starting out by hitting U.S. bases, guaranteeing that they would intervene. You don't know that they're going to intervene. If you created a blockade around Taiwan, you would leave it for the United States to draw first blood and make it abundantly clear to the whole world why you're sinking their fleet, which China has the ability to do. It makes no sense.
It beggars belief what kind of people we're dealing with here, man. And these are the people who are actually giving advice to the government. And secondly, they said that they are launching flights from the Philippines. First of all, we don't even know if the Philippines will want to be involved, and I don't think there is a
I don't think that there is there. Because the last time I checked, the Philippines have been and are trying to keep the United States its military as far away from the Philippines as possible. There might be like some sort of presence the U.S. has because they like to invite themselves in and never leave. But I don't think that they have any. And I know they're trying to, and this is the whole thing. They're not trying to create a military presence across the region to make it more secure. They're doing it specifically to destabilize the entire region. Every country in the region, including Japan and South Korea, count China as their largest export market.
Yeah, I mean, this video is out in the public. So imagine if any Filipino people were looking at this video, or Philippine leaders were looking at this video and thinking, bloody hell, we didn't sign up for this. I mean, what do you think will happen to Philippines if US starts launching, airplanes from Philippines to attack Chinese interests? Obviously, Philippines was going to be a target. So there is no way the Philippines would agree to this. And they will probably be looking at this video absolutely crapping themselves, thinking, oh God, the United States is bringing us into a conflict and they didn't even tell us.
And that's the thing. That's the thing. The U.S. wants to get all of Southeast Asia involved in this, and Southeast Asia wants nothing to do with it, which is why the United States, in addition to all of its provocations against China through Taiwan, they're also funding anti-government movements across the entire region, trying to overthrow governments in Southeast Asia to install client regimes that will invite the U.S. military in and turn the entire region into a battlefield, destroying the collective economies of Asia, so that the U.S. can maintain hegemony over everyone. This is what's going on, and it's, look at Ukraine from 2014 onward. That is an example of the U.S. installing a regime into power that then the country self-destructed because of that client regime, because it was serving U.S. interests rather than the interests of the people in the actual country. And they're trying to do the same thing all across Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, here in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, in Malaysia, in Indonesia. They're trying to do this across the entire region. It's extremely disruptive, and again, it's indicative of who is actually the real threat to peace and prosperity.
That's right. And there is no way the Chinese would attack Japan or South Korea as a first strike. It doesn't make any sense to bring more enemies into this conflict. I mean, the most China would do is just blockade Taiwan, and they will stop all supplies going in. And eventually they will cave in. They will be like, Taiwan will be like, okay, we surrender, because they know they don't have a chance. And the West is not going to get involved, because if they come anywhere near, there's going to be huge escalation. So it's going to be a very much, I think China will want it happen as peacefully as possible. There is no way they would start blowing up Japan. And
one more thing before we go, if you're going to go through any more of this, just imagine if they did the same thing about Russia and Ukraine before it happened. It would be the same as saying, well, the first thing Russia will do is carry out missile strikes on Poland and Romania and who else? Who else could they launch a preemptive strike again? Maybe some U.S. military bases across Europe. No, they didn't. They didn't need to, and neither does China.
Exactly. All right, let me play the rest of it. It gets funnier.
China went with a very, very aggressive strike campaign against U.S. forces and bases throughout the region. The gloves are off, if you will. I mean, by attacking U.S. territory of Guam, killing Americans, the Chinese have crossed the line. I think they've also miscalculated already that they took some actions against U.S. forces in Japan that they thought would maybe prevent Japan from coming in. It actually drew Japan in. Same with Australia. How do we prevent the Chinese force that's trying to get across the Strait of Taiwan to actually be able to successfully land and start taking Taiwanese territory?
Now this is just a matter of getting as many things into the fight as we can, as quickly as possible. Getting the Australians involved in a blockade and checking out what's in the strait with the Marine Littoral Regiment subs, relying on our allies to watch the rear and maintain supply lines and maybe implement a blockade while we're fighting in the strait, in and around the straits with Taiwan.
We believe the longer this takes, the less able we will be able to achieve our objectives. And so we are in the course of this building in fallback positions, although we don't want to tell that to the other team. Move 2 is building on all of that and moving forward to land on Taiwan, to further try to take out American assets in the region, and also to go after Japan, which has entered the war.
The fact that they aggressively hit Guam and Japan was frankly just a very quick way to make sure our allies were all in. And now we have Japanese resources willing to contribute to air and undersea. We have Australians willing to contribute and others coming on board.
My sense is that we need to at least take out the airfields in northern Australia. So at least try to.
So like Darwin and Tyndall?
Darwin and Tyndall. The fuel tanks are very important because that's how those planes get refueled. And the runways are important because they need somewhere to take off.
In Hawaii, you have both obviously American territory, which they seek to preserve, plus you have all of the naval and air assets that the Americans have dispersed back that way once this war started, so there's a lot of targets out there. They hit our ports in China, we're going to take the fight to Hawaii.
I'm a little bit hesitant to use conventional kinetic attacks in Hawaii just because I feel that will be interpreted as a Pearl Harbor in the United States.
Yep.
Oh, really?
Would galvanize significant U.S. support.
China's big strike, which was in response to the U.S. Attacking its ports, was on Hawaii. And they launched their stealth bombers, which launched cruise missiles and hypersonic weapons against Hawaii. It took out the command center on Hickam Air Force Base, where they're controlling Blue Air Forces and commanding the air war. So an American state has now been attacked.
What was the blue team's move?
The blue team was focused on destroying China's big warships that provide a lot of air defense for the invasion fleet. So they had submarines within the strait. I would say right now the red team is ahead. They're starting to make progress towards their objective of actually gaining control over Taiwanese territory. But they have a long, hard slog in front of them.
After move 1, you said we were at a stalemate. After move 2, what would you say?
I would say that China has a slight advantage right now because it's actually ashore. So it has made progress towards achieving its objective. It still has a long way to go. But both sides are probably running low of some of the key missiles and munitions that they use. So the character of the fight might change going forward.
All right.
Okay.
On to move.
Okay. So let's talk about a shortage of weapons and ammunition. The U.S. already has that because they're waging a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine.
Exactly.
Then they think they're going to then move on to fight China with the largest industrial base on Earth, and they think somehow they're going to be able to do that and even come close to matching the ability for China to reconstitute its forces, resupply its forces in its own territory. It's insane, and this is why when you listen to something like this. It's hard to tell whether they're this dumb or this is all just solely for public consumption. China's going to attack Hawaii, China, because it really paints China out as violent, evil, and a threat to the United States. People think when they introduced this in the beginning, they introduced Taiwan as it's some innocent country that China's bullying, and they don't really fully explain the reality that even the U.S. recognizes Taiwan as part of one China. They don't make that clear deliberately. And then for China to attack Hawaii, I mean, what is this? Is a step-by-step direct war with the United States when it didn't have to involve the U.S. at all, and the U.S. would have to be the aggressor as always, and then be at the disadvantage because of it. Chinese decision makers would have to be completely disconnected from reality to do anything even resembling this strategy that they laid out.
Exactly. And again, you can see the Philippines getting bombed, and they didn't even mention anything about Philippines being bombed. They're more interested about Hawaii being bombed, and they didn't even mention Japan and Australia. Exactly. The fact that little Philippines is being bombed, they didn't even say, "Oh, poor Philippines." They even completely missed that out. And yeah, it doesn't make any sense for China to actively start, hitting Hawaii, U.S. bases like in Guam as well, because at the end of the day, it just doesn't make any sense because that is an attack to U.S. territory, and obviously that would push everyone behind a war with China, and this is just going to escalate the conflict even more. It doesn't make any sense.
It's completely, the things that they're saying are completely childish. No adult who is even remotely interested in geopolitics and military matters, even just have a passing interest in it, would think any of this was viable.
Exactly. So the final bit is the most funniest bit. I literally fell off my seat. I fell off my seat when
right now. That means that the U.S. or the West would back down. I wonder if we could do a hem shot not over but near where the U.S. most of the U.S. forces are, because that would be clear signaling to them that we are serious about using nuclear weapons. But obviously, wouldn't want it right over in this area at this point.
So you're saying a demonstration explosion?
Yeah, at higher altitude.
And is this a bluff, or are we really willing to use nuclear weapons?
I think that depends on folks in the room, but I think in a no-kidding Taiwan scenario, if we are really facing the prospect of defeat, we should be willing to use nuclear weapons. It might not be nuclear weapons on Taiwan. It could be a tactical nuke against invading U.S. or intervening U.S. forces.
A real big weakness is our inability to contest or threaten China's air superiority. We keep trying, but the difficulty is in our dispersed posture with limited access to tankers. We're not able to push enough tactical aviation forward over Taiwan to really maintain persistent air superiority or even just contest Chinese air superiority.
I think the key insight already in this game is if you have not spent years preparing for this, pre-positioning munitions, getting the Taiwanese ready, pre-positioning your own forces, developing your dispersal bases. If you haven't spent years preparing for this, then you're going to be behind the 8 ball the whole way. How about putting a bunch of SEALs on the island by submarines and try to support the Marines?
The biggest concern is that the United States will come roaring back with everything it has, not over a short period of time, but a long period of time. We have calculated that America's in and America's in. But there may be gradations of what it means for America to fight our country. And we have seen time and time again, once the enraged bull elephant is fully stirred, its ability to make war and to generate the resources to make war is unbelievably large. The only thing the Americans seem to declare defeat on is really, really long wars, not short, violent ones. Afghanistan, in Iraq, forever they wanted to go home. Vietnam, they wanted to go home. They get tired, but they don't get scared.
I think experience has shown that this bridgehead here, just like in Ukraine, it's not going to be over in a few days unless Taiwan capitulates.
If you watched what happened in Ukraine, you know, the actions that were taken before the invasion were important, but so is continued resupply. With Ukraine, you have borders that you can move things across. Taiwan's a long ways off.
So here we are after move 3. The blue team, the United States, seemed to try to do what it could to make command and control more difficult in the actual invasion itself of Taiwan and all of that. China and the red team wanted to send more of a message to the United States, attempting to strike Alaska and California, San Diego specifically, plus Hawaii again. So
the Chargers
everywhere,
not the Chargers.
A nuclear test by China to essentially make the United States take the nuclear option more seriously.
Oh my God.
So where are we now?
Things spiraled really quickly. The headline is the nuclear test, which is unprecedented since World War II. We haven't seen limited nuclear use, certainly during combat. We don't know where things go from here. There were also the attempted strikes on the United States. China has continued to reinforce its lodgment on Taiwan, but it's still very small and it's heavily contested. The U.S. is pushing in some of its ships now that munition stockpiles have gone down to try to support them, and it looks like we're in for a long, hard fight.
So best case scenario is that it's a ground war in Taiwan. Worst case scenario is we're starting to have some nuclear exchanges.
Yes. China still has its intercontinental ballistic missiles that are nuclear armed, but it also has the ones that can range Guam and sort of this area that it could use, which have nuclear warheads.
Well, there are a lot of lessons to take away from this. This was fascinating, and I can't wait to get to the lessons learned portion when we do that in a little bit.
Go ahead, Brian. I mean, I wish this was a parody, but it's not a parody.
It's not. And you know, if you follow these think tanks, these are the people that are cited across the Western media, taken seriously across the Western media, and these are think tanks that are funded by the U.S. government to help generate policy and doctrines. It's incredibly scary that they're like little children. Again, all China would have to do is, and they're already doing this without even having to use a blockade. They're putting pressure, economic pressure on Taiwan because half of Taiwan's exports go to the rest of China, and their biggest industries are completely dependent on China for the rest of China for raw materials. So all they have to do is just put some pressure on that, and everything in on the island collapses, and people really have no choice. And the people responsible for it, the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party that the U.S. installed into power, people are going to blame them for it, and they're going to want to get rid of them, and they're going to want to. Before the DPP came along, very gradual, slow, incremental, mutually beneficial integration was already taking place, and it was going to continue, and the U.S. disrupted it because they're out of time. They knew that if everything being as it is left alone, it would have worked in China's favor, and it still will. So this whole thing, this is their dream. This is their dream. If China makes every decision is the wrong decision, and they could justify some kind of war. But did you hear that part where he thinks this is World War II, and when the U.S. decides to go to war, they really go to war. You've woken up the elephant or whatever he was talking about. This isn't World War II where you're up against numerically, countries with populations smaller than you, and countries with smaller industrial bases than you. This is China that has 4 or 5 times more people and a larger industrial base than you do. So I don't know how they're figuring that. I don't know where that comes from.
It's funny to see that little Asian woman who was suggesting nuking, sending a nuke near the United States.
Well, she learned a new word, hemp shot, and she wanted to use the word hemp shot to sound like she's a military expert.
Yeah,
and so I think that's what tempted her to roll that out.
Yeah, and the female host here, she said China's going to send a nuclear test near American shores. I mean, come on, if that isn't going to start a nuclear war, I mean, there is no point even sending an invasion force from United States all the way to Taiwan. You might as well just throw nuclear weapons at, all of Taiwan, all of China. It's just there is no point having a war anymore. If the first country that throws a nuclear weapon, the first country that throws a nuclear weapon, that's it. That's the end of the world. There's no point planning anything after that. There's going to be a huge nuclear exchange, and that's it. It's going to be the end. I mean, nobody wins in a nuclear war. And it's funny how these guys, the female is saying, "Oh, China's going to send a test near American shores." If you're in a war situation, there is no test. You either fire a nuclear missile or you don't.
Again, everything about this is it's hard to tell whether they're really this ignorant or they're designing all of this just to prey on the ignorance of the public. Because I think a lot of people in the public, I've heard people talk about how dangerous China is, how their military is a big threat to everyone, and they've got this or that they said or they're going to do. And they buy into it, and it's because of propaganda like this. So in that sense, they're very successful. They may not be winning over people that even casually look into geopolitics and military matters, but the overall general public, maybe they're swayed by this. I can't tell you how many people fall for this. Even people who are aware of what's going on in Ukraine still fall for this. They still buy into this type of propaganda. So I guess that's kind of what our job is. Our job is to try to accelerate the process of people seeing through these lies so that they understand the situation around Taiwan as well as they're beginning to understand the situation around Ukraine. Because the faster that happens, the shorter the window of opportunity is for the U.S. to exploit people's ignorance and get yet another war of aggression going somewhere else in the world that's going to destroy everybody's lives involved.
Exactly. Somebody said, Hung Chua said she's Taiwanese, and it makes sense. And this is exactly what's happening in Ukraine. You have Zelensky and his cronies trying to escalate the war to bring in the West, to bring in NATO, to bring in the United States. And they're even talking about nuclear exchange as well. And I think if she's Taiwanese, then it makes sense for her to do that, to escalate the war, escalate a nuclear exchange, because she will probably want to see China being completely destroyed, and this is the only way to do it. So it makes sense why she would say something like that.
Yeah, I want to make a point here about the type of people on Taiwan, on this island of Taiwan, that the U.S. is maneuvering into positions of power and influence, and including in their think tanks and everything. These are people they pick specifically because they don't understand how anything works, and they want to feed their ego. They want money. They want influence. They want exposure, and they're willing to go along with anything to get it. That's why they pick these people, not because they're knowledgeable about anything. Because there's a lot of people on Taiwan who are very reasonable, who understand that this is not in their best interest. This has nothing to do with freedom and democracy, and the U.S. is our ally. They know that, and a lot of the smartest people on Taiwan, they're doing business with mainland China, the rest of China. They're doing business with them. That's where the best and brightest of Taiwan. That's what they're doing, and they're trying their best to avoid this and buy time so that this danger created by Washington passes without any of this even having to be contemplated. Like again, in Beijing, they're not thinking about, oh yes, ideally we would like to wage war and take Taiwan by force. No, ideally they would want to go back to the period of time before 2016 when and before 2014 when the U.S. was stirring things up politically on Taiwan. They want to go back to that period of time where gradual incremental reintegration was taking place, because that's what was happening. That's what was in everybody's best interest. And only now, and look at what they're talking about. They're talking about nukes and what do you think this is going to do to Taiwan if this actually ever happens? Even the scenario that you and I, AJ, we were talking about earlier, what realistically China might do if it decided to use military force, that is going to completely destroy Taiwan, just like Ukraine is being destroyed right now. Who benefits from that? Not anyone on the mainland, not anyone on the island. Only Washington benefits. Chinese people killing Chinese people, just like Slavs killing Slavs in Eastern Europe.
Frankie Boy has mentioned, notice the drop in recruitment. And it sounds to me that United States, they know that they don't have the recruitment numbers to fight a real major war. So what they're using is these countries like Ukraine, fighting till the last Ukrainian. And with China, they'll probably fight till the last Japanese, the last South Korean, the last Australian, even probably the last Philippines, and just fight from a distance, try and hit Chinese trade routes, try and block the Malacca Strait, try and use subs. And I think that's probably going to be, because you would think that the people who are in charge of the United States, the administration, they're probably not that clever. But the people in the military are probably a lot more cleverer than what you have running the country. And I'm not talking about General Milley. I think he's just a face. But the people kind of, I think he's just somebody put in place just to kind of send out this woke agenda or something. But the actual people who actually run the military, the leaders of the Navy, Air Force, I think they would probably question anything they're asked to do. They'll be like, no, we're not doing this. This is the way to do it. And I think it'll be quite different. I think United States would use other lives first rather than their own, and not do something stupid like send an aircraft carrier.
Point. Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. And there are a lot of capable people in the U.S. military who I think have been saying no to one administration after the other. There's a continuity of agenda, so it's not really pinning it on one administration or the other. I'm just saying that there have been points in recent American history where I think they would have liked to have done something regarding Iran or something more regarding Russia. People in the military said no. But that's why those people don't really get promoted, and people like Milley do. People like Petraeus end up getting promoted and getting appointed to all these different positions because they're yes men. They'll agree to anything because they're just trying to advance their own career and their own retirement plan. Their plans for retirement. They're nice, cushy job at one of these think tanks that push these type of policies out. So it's a scary time. Luckily, for the time being, Russia and China are being patient. They're weathering a lot of, I would even say, humiliation at the hands of the West, but because they know in the long run, it's going to come out in their favor, and we all just have to keep doing our part to wake people up, and to resist, to speak out against this and resist it, to explain to people what's really going on, because the Western media isn't, and you can see how dangerous these lies are, and the type of direction society is put in because of these lies.
Exactly. We're coming up to 2-hour figure. So let's finish up by talking a final thing about Ukraine. The last I heard that Russia is building up its force. They're obviously clearing up Kherson. All the civilians are being asked to evacuate. Looks like there's going to be a massive war in Kherson. Same thing that happened in Donbass. And I don't see it go any other way apart from a huge Russian victory here. And I can see more lives being lost in Ukraine. And I think once Russia takes over Kherson, do you think they will head all the way to Odessa? Because Odessa seems to be a flashpoint for Russia, because from Odessa there has been a lot of attacks into Crimea. Obviously the latest one was in Sevastopol. Do you think Odessa would be next in the crosshairs, or do you think Russia will just sit back and wait for Ukraine to implode, and which they will pretty soon? What do you think?
Okay, I will get into Ukraine. I need a really short intermission here because I was drinking a ton of coffee this whole time.
Oh yeah,
can you
sure.
maybe explain where people can find your work and my work,
Yeah.
and then I will be right
No
back.
problem. No problem.
My apologies.
Yeah. So guys, if you want to find Brian, he's on the description. His website, his YouTube, and his Telegram. And if you want to find me, all the stuff is there. Don't forget to like and share, help the algorithm. We have reached over 1,000 viewers, which is great. We are doing something brand new. I think a lot of people are probably bored listening to Ukraine all the time. So we are doing something very much about the military. Obviously, Brian used to be in the military, so he's got a wealth of knowledge about the military. So I thought it would be something educational for you guys to discuss the Chinese military, because not many channels discuss it, because not many channels know about it. A lot of the Western channels I see about the military are very one-sided, pro-West. A lot of them still believe that Russia is losing, Ukraine is still winning, so you can't really believe anything you see. So if you really want to hear the real stuff, this is the channel to follow. So yeah, I am getting a lot more guests on board. Tomorrow I've got a very special guest, to keep a lookout for that. A very special guest tomorrow. He is a superstar. He was in Redacted a few days ago. He's going to be a very, very special guest. I'm not going to say exactly who. I'm going to leave it for a surprise. But yeah, you'll be absolutely amazed by that guest. But he was on Redacted a few days ago, so keep an eye out for that. Yeah, Brian, I was just saying that I've got this really special guest coming on tomorrow, and actually I wanted to keep his name secret, but I'm probably gonna say it's Lucas Gage. I don't know if you know him. He was an ex-military guy, and he's recently come on board. And he was on Redacted, the channel, a few days ago. And obviously he's speaking out against the Ukraine war. And he served 2 military tours in Iraq as well. And yeah, he's very much like yourself. He knows a lot about what's going on. And he used to be in the military. And he's really is fed up of the way the United States is going about its business. And it'd be really good to talk to him. So he's coming on tomorrow. So it'd be really good to kind of catch up with him. So yeah, over back to you, Brian. You were talking about Ukraine.
So the situation in Ukraine right now, you're looking at the front line, and it's more or less stable. There's obviously fighting taking place along it. You have Ukraine doing reconnaissance in force, or what appears to be reconnaissance in force. This is where they're attacking different Russian defenses along the line to try to ascertain the disposition of Russian forces. They suffer huge losses doing this, and they're getting ready. Everyone seems to agree. They're getting ready for another big push toward Kherson. Russia is getting ready for it as well, supposedly building up their defenses around the city on the west bank of the Dnieper River, and also evacuating the civilian population to the east bank. What is going to happen here? I don't know. So far, Russian forces have stopped every single offensive Ukraine has launched around Kherson. Whichever way it goes, whether Russian forces keep the city or leave, Ukrainian forces are going to lose huge amounts of men and equipment that they cannot replace. I just went over the last $400 million U.S. aid package, and most of the items on the package are refurbishments. They're large amounts of equipment that the U.S. is paying to refurbish and then send to Ukraine. So they're out of existing inventory items to send Ukraine. So this is an indicator that Western support for Ukraine is dwindling. And some people say, well, Brian, that's just the U.S. The U.S. by far has been sending the most equipment, the most ammunition, the most everything to Ukraine. Everyone else has been sending tiny amounts by comparison. And so if the U.S. is running out of equipment and ammunition to send Ukraine, then so is everyone else, or they already have long ago. What is Ukraine going to do after they launch this? However it turns out, they might get a brief political victory, or it might just get crushed. And then what? What do they do? Where are they replacing their trained manpower with? What are they going to replace all these heavy weapons they're going to lose? I don't know. I saw a video, and you cannot confirm these things, but they had these light armored vehicles all lined up, where instead they should have had tanks, but they don't have any more tanks to send in those type of numbers. So this is the situation Ukraine's in. Russia is more than well aware of this. They're playing the long game. They are more than willing to trade territory to save the lives of their men and their heavy equipment. They know that whatever territory they lose, this is in the long game, temporary. They will get it back. That goes for Kharkov as well. If they want that back, they will get that back eventually. They're bringing in 300,000 additional men to reinforce the front lines. So you have to think about what that means versus what Ukraine is able to reinforce their front lines with. They've been running a deficit in trained manpower for a long time. The West has tried to drum up all of these training programs in Europe, but just the fact that you have to take Ukrainian men, send them out of the country to train and come back, that right there, do you see how much more complicated that is than just training them and sending them to the front line in Ukraine? But they can't, because any training center in Ukraine is going to be hit. So this is the problem they have when Ukrainian vehicles are damaged or heavy weapons are damaged. They have to ship them all the way to Poland. If you're fighting in the Donbas region, that's 1,000 kilometers one way and another 1,000 the other way, just to send it to get repaired and come back. So think about how impractical that is, and how long do you think Ukraine can continue doing that, especially with a lot of their rail apparently relying on electric traction. So they're out of electricity. So how are they going to be moving things around? They have a limited amount of diesel locomotives, and I'm sure that those will end up being targeted next. The fact that everything is going to be using diesel generators at essential infrastructure throughout the country, that's less diesel for your vehicles on the front line. So it's a huge problem that continues to compound as time goes by. From Russia's perspective, they have time. They're not the ones facing an economic and energy crisis. They're also not the ones facing a crisis in terms of material support. You see the Garan 2 drones. This is something that they just introduced in the middle of their ongoing military operation. They introduced them in the middle, and they have more of them coming. Does Ukraine have anything like that they can point to and say we have more of that coming as well? And the answer is no. They do not. So people have to be patient. They have to think about the big picture, not look at a specific part on the map. The Kharkov offensive, yes, they got all of this territory back, Ukraine did, but at what cost? And what is that territory doing for them now? Now they have all of this additional territory that they have to patrol it. They have to invest in holding it. They've got their troops stretched out even further, and they have less to supply them with. So what sense did that make, except to gain temporary political points.
Exactly. And I completely.
Yeah. Any other questions about Ukraine? Because I don't remember what all of your questions were.
Oh no, that's fine. I was going to agree with what you said, because when you play the long game, and this is war we're talking about, it's more important to look at the whole picture. If you lose lives and you lose equipment, that will affect you more than if you lose land, and you can gain land, you can lose land, it's all part of war. This has happened for centuries. When you're in a war, you lose land, but when you lose people, that is hard to replace. You cannot lose, you cannot just make someone out of thin air. Obviously you need to go through a process, pregnancy, birth, and 18, 19 years of your life, and then you got to train, and to lose a life is much more important to a country, and also to lose equipment. If you have no people and you have no equipment, then it doesn't matter what land you have, you will lose that land eventually. And you just got to look at it in the long term. And I think Ukraine has been very stupid in having these offensive in Kherson, in Kharkiv, for very small gains. And what cost? If you're losing thousands of men per day, is it really worth it? I don't think so. And if you're losing so much equipment per day, is it really worth it? I don't think so. Sometimes. Go on. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, Ukraine is trading their army for territories.
Yeah.
So now you got the territory, but you have no more army left.
It makes no sense.
What's going to happen to that territory?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like there's no common sense in how these guys are running their military. I mean, there's no strategy, there's no war strategy, there's no common sense. They're just throwing lives, and they're throwing people at a problem that's not even there. Gaining these little territories is not going to make any difference whatsoever. There is no way you can beat Russia, and I know what the West is doing. They're trying to tell the Ukrainians, oh, you can win this war, don't worry, keep going, we're behind you, we'll keep sending you weapons, we'll keep doing this, we'll keep doing that, giving the Ukrainians a false sense of hope, and is killing them. These Ukrainians, they don't even realize that they are systematically being killed and destroyed. And one thing that did change the Russian strategy regarding blowing up infrastructure in Ukraine. Do you remember when the Crimean bridge got blown up, and there was Ukrainian people taking pictures with this massive stamp on the wall, and they were taking pictures, they were posting it on social media. And I was on Twitter that day, and Twitter actually blew up. There was people retweeting it, and it was trending. And it went right to #1 when it was trending, and people were smiling. People in Kiev were smiling, taking a picture in front of it. I think that was the turning point. I think Russia said, you know what, we're done trying to protect these people. They don't care about us. They're just making fun of us. So let's just kind of end this war. Because when you think about it, when you start blowing up infrastructure and certain things in Kiev, that costs money. So all of this money that the West is giving to Ukraine, all of that's going to be redirected into repairs and reconstruction. And especially when the power goes out, then you're going to obviously spend a lot of money to repair it. And this money, that means it's not going to go into the military. This money will be spent going on to repairing things rather than going onto the military. And I think that's their tactic going forward. They're going to try and bleed the West dry. They're going to carry on blowing up parts of Kiev, so lots of the money gets redirected to repairs and reconstruction, and less money goes into the military. And this money is just drying up day by day, week by week. It's becoming less and less. And Ukraine is not making any money. I mean, come on. I mean, there's hardly any businesses in Ukraine. Most people have left the country. The rest are fighting and killing themselves for a war that they're not going to win. It's quite saddening, Brian. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the attack on the infrastructure, and this is part of Russia's incremental escalation strategy. They could have done that on the first day.
Yeah.
The end of February, they could have went in and they could have just destroyed Ukraine's infrastructure. But this does not fit into the way Russia sees Ukraine, and this does not fit in to the way Russia would ideally like to solve this problem. But if Ukraine's leadership, if enough people are following that leadership, going along with it, and if the West continues supporting that leadership, then they have to escalate. They have to continue escalating. They're not going to do it all at once. Again, I've said this many times. A lot of people said Russia's calling it a special military operation, but it's an all-out invasion. It's a total war on Ukraine. Obviously, it wasn't, because if it was, they would have done that on the first day. It's very obvious. It's abundantly clear that Russia has the ability to continue escalating. There are other things they can do to escalate this conflict. There's other ways they can attack the infrastructure and really hurt Ukraine on a national scale that they're holding back from doing. They're doing it incrementally. And just like you said, with the hitting the Crimean bridge and the possibility, the very high possibility that Ukraine, with the help of its Western sponsors, organized that and were involved in that. That just unties Russia's hands so that they can continue escalating until, just like you said, they are going to destroy the economy and everything coming into it, because it's being propped up by the West.
Yeah.
So the West is a black hole. It's turning into a black hole, sucking up all of the West's financial and military resources. We're watching that happen. And for these people to think that they're going to just turn around and then start some kind of war with China, it's just completely insane. I don't know what's going on anymore.
Exactly.
In Washington, London, Brussels.
It's crazy.
I don't
it's
think
crazy.
they know either.
No. What do you think about the U.S. troops or Western troops are in and around Kherson? Because I'm hearing stories that U.S. troops have landed in Ukraine and they are operating within Ukraine. What do you think about those stories? Would this be an
Ultimately,
escalation?
yeah. I mean, if they are operating, they don't want to. The U.S. is going to continue denying it if they are. If the U.S. is sending its troops in there knowingly, purposefully, these aren't private military contractors or something, or some loophole. They're just doing it covertly. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to make any difference. The problem that Ukraine and the U.S. and its allies have is they don't have the right type of military hardware to fight this kind of conflict. They simply don't. They did not invest in multiple launch rocket systems, artillery, air defense systems, everything that is being used in this conflict. They did not invest in that to the point where they would be able to even match Russia, let alone outmatch Russia. So I don't know what difference it's going to make. It's going to prolong the conflict, that is for sure. Even the support the U.S. is sending is going to continue to prolong it, but it's not going to change the outcome. It's just a matter of how many people they want to see die, and how much Europe is paying the price for this too, in all sorts of ways. The longer this goes on, the less and less is going to be left of Europe.
Exactly. So let's come to the end of the show. Do you have anything more to say? We just reached just over 2 hours. We've had a pretty good following today. Do you have any last words before we go, Brian?
Well, I just think people should look at what's going on in Ukraine, the way it was the U.S. who started this in 2014. I don't think that it was a coincidence that also in 2014, the U.S. was meddling heavily in China in the very same way, backing political opposition groups that don't reflect the best interests of the people living in China, and the euro made on in not the best interests of the Ukrainian people. They're trying to maneuver these opposition groups into positions of power in Ukraine, in Taipei. They were trying to do it in Hong Kong to create death and destruction, to create division so that they can divide up their perceived adversaries and maintain hegemony over all of them. What is going on between the U.S. and Russia is the exact same thing that's going on between the U.S. and China. There is no difference. And it's not a coincidence that Russia and China are working together. A lot of people think that Russia is just working with China because they have no choice. As a matter of fact, they have a lot in common. A lot of the disagreements they've had in the past is in the past. We're not talking about the same Russia that existed during the Cold War. We're not talking about the same China that existed then. We're talking about two completely different systems that have evolved in major ways over the decades to where they are now, and they are on the same page and they're working together. They both genuinely believe in multipolarism, and they're working and fighting hard to make it a reality. So we have to look at this as a big picture. Not, again, I'm addressing the people who seem to understand what's going on in Ukraine, but somehow think that China is, I don't know what they think China is, but it's because they're buying into the Western propaganda regarding China while rejecting it regarding Ukraine and Russia. So this is, I think, is a huge problem that if more and more people could get past and understand the big picture here, I think the more beneficial it will be for all of us who are trying to speak up about this and trying to raise awareness and get people to resist this agenda.
Thanks for that, Brian. I completely agree with you. Will you come back again? I know it's been a very different kind of live stream today. We talked about different subjects that not many others are talking about. Sometimes it gets a bit boring just talking about Ukraine only or talking about China only. So we're trying something different here, talking about military aspects of it. I don't think there's any other channels that went as deep as we have regarding the Chinese military. And not many other Western military channels know that much about the Chinese military as well. They're just assuming China is the same as it was in the Korean War, for example, or the Vietnam War. But yeah, it's been very educational for me as well. Also listening to you, Brian, really appreciate it. So I think the viewers are asking, will you come again? Will you join us again in the future?
Sure. Stream? Yeah, and we'll think of some other topic to dive into for next time.
Exactly.
And as always, AJ, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I really appreciate the audience hanging in there. And so again, thank you.
No problem, Brian. I appreciate your time and appreciate you coming on. I want to thank all the moderators. I want to thank everyone that's been listening to us so far. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. And tune in again, guys. Don't forget to like and share, subscribe. You know what to do. Thanks, guys. See you soon.